My own sister looked me in the eye at my anniversary dinner and told me she'd been seeing my husband for over a year. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them. I just sat there because some part of me had already started grieving the two of them months earlier, quietly, on my own, long before either of them found the courage to say it out loud. That's how Claire Whitman remembers the night her marriage and her relationship with her only sister fell apart in the same conversation. To understand how she found herself sitting so still across from the two people who'd betrayed her, you have to go back to where it all started, long before any of them knew how the story would end. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Claire and her younger sister Danielle grew up 3 years apart in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, close enough in age that people often assumed they were best friends, and different enough in temperament that the assumption was almost always wrong. Claire was steady and dependable, the kind of daughter teachers praised and neighbors trusted with their spare keys. Danielle was brighter somehow, magnetic in a way that drew people toward her without her ever seeming to try. The kind of younger sister who got away with things Claire never could, simply because she smiled at exactly the right moment. Their mother used to joke, not entirely kindly, that Claire was the daughter she could count on, and Danielle was the daughter everyone else fell in love with. Claire had heard some version of that joke often enough growing up that she'd stopped noticing how much it actually stung, though it never fully stopped stinging. There was a particular memory Claire returned to often in the years that followed, one she hadn't thought about in ages until everything fell apart. She was 12, Danielle 9, and their father had taken them both to a father-daughter dance at the community center, an awkward, sweet little event neither girl fully understood the point of at the time. Claire had spent weeks practicing a simple routine with her father in the living room, taking it seriously in the careful, earnest way she took everything. Danielle, without practicing at all, had simply climbed onto their father's shoes and let him carry her around the floor, laughing the whole time. And every single person watching had turned to smile at the two of them instead. Claire remembered standing at the edge of the room afterward, 12 years old, quietly understanding for the first time that effort and being adored were sometimes two entirely different things, and that she had, without meaning to, chosen the harder path. It wasn't a memory Claire held with bitterness. Not exactly. It was simply the earliest version of a pattern she would spend the rest of her life half noticing and half ignoring. The pattern of Danielle receiving warmth simply by existing in a room, and Claire receiving it only once she'd proven she deserved it. Claire met Ryan Whitman in her final year of nursing school, at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, where he'd spent most of the afternoon quietly fixing someone's broken grill instead of mingling, which struck Claire, watching from across the yard. As a strangely endearing way to spend a Saturday, Ryan worked in commercial insurance, steady and warm, in a way that matched Claire's own temperament almost perfectly. They dated for 2 years, married in a small ceremony at Claire's childhood church, and settled into a comfortable life in a modest house 20 minutes from where they'd both grown up. Danielle was Claire's maid of honor. She gave a toast that made half the room cry, describing Ryan as the steady hands my sister always deserved, a line Claire would return to many times in the years that followed. With a heartbreak she never expected to feel toward her own sister, the early years of the marriage were, by any honest account, genuinely happy ones. Ryan and Claire built the kind of quiet, uneventful life together that neither of them ever felt the need to perform for anyone else. Weekend errands, Sunday dinners at Claire's mother's house, small inside jokes that accumulated slowly over years the way they do in any good marriage. Claire used to think, without any particular drama attached to the thought, that she'd simply gotten lucky, that she'd found the one steady thing in a family where she'd always felt slightly overlooked. It made what came later cut even deeper, she would say afterward, because Ryan hadn't just been her husband. For a long time, he'd genuinely been the person who made her feel like the version of herself nobody else had bothered to notice. For years, nothing about how often Danielle was around seemed unusual. She lived alone, worked inconsistent hours in real estate, and had always treated Claire and Ryan's house as a kind of second home, dropping by for Sunday dinners, helping Ryan around the yard when Claire pulled long hospital shifts, staying late some evenings simply because she said she liked the company. Claire had always found it sweet, honestly, that her husband and her sister got along so easily. She used to tell friends, without a trace of irony, that she felt lucky the two most important people in her life liked each other so much. The season, everything quietly began changing. Claire would only be able to name, looking back, months after it had already started. It was the spring Danielle went through a painful breakup and began coming around more than usual, sometimes staying for dinner 3 or 4 nights a week, always for some reasonable enough reason. She didn't want to eat alone. She was between apartments. She just missed being around family. Ryan, easygoing as ever, never seemed to mind the extra company. Claire, exhausted from rotating shifts, was often simply grateful that Ryan had someone to sit with on the nights she couldn't make it home for dinner. She didn't notice the shift in the air until nearly a year later, and even then, only in small, forgettable moments she didn't yet know how to name. She came home early once, a shift unexpectedly canceled, and found Ryan and Danielle at the kitchen table laughing over something on Danielle's phone, both of them angling it away the moment she walked in a way that felt, for a fraction of a second, strangely careful. Claire brushed the feeling off almost as quickly as it arrived. It was such a small thing, hardly worth examining, and Ryan had always been effortlessly warm with everyone he met. But the feeling didn't fully leave. It settled instead into something quieter, a low hum in the back of her chest she mostly managed not to listen to, noticing only in passing the small things that meant nothing on their own. A text that made Ryan smile in a particular way she didn't remember him smiling at texts from anyone else. A weekend trip Danielle mentioned that Ryan somehow already knew the details of. A birthday gift Danielle gave him that felt, in some way, Claire couldn't quite explain. Oddly intimate for a sister-in-law to have chosen. It was her own heart, honestly, more than any single piece of evidence that finally told her the truth before her mind was ready to accept it. She remembers standing in her kitchen one evening, watching the two of them through the window from the driveway before she'd even opened the car door, watching the particular way Ryan leaned toward Danielle while she talked, the way Danielle laughed with her whole body, the way she used to laugh at things, Claire said, back before Claire had stopped being the person who made her laugh like that. Nothing happened in that moment. Nobody touched, nobody said anything incriminating. But something in Claire simply knew. The quiet, certain way you know a storm is coming before the sky has actually changed color. She sat with that knowing for a long time before she let herself look directly at it. Grief, she would say later, doesn't always wait for confirmation. Sometimes it arrives early, sits with you for months, and simply waits for the rest of the world to catch up to what your heart already understood. In the weeks after that evening in the driveway, Claire found herself doing something she wasn't proud of, quietly searching her own memory for reasons she might have caused it, wondering whether she'd worked too many hospital shifts, whether she'd stopped being the kind of wife who made Ryan feel chosen, whether some flaw in her had simply pushed him toward someone easier to love. She mentioned this once to Renata, expecting some reassurance, and instead got something more useful. "You're allowed to ask what you could have done differently," Renata told her over coffee one evening. "But don't you dare let yourself believe there's an answer that makes what they did make sense. People don't have affairs because their spouse worked too many night shifts. They have affairs because somewhere along the way they decided their own comfort mattered more than someone else's trust." Claire didn't fully believe her at first. It took months of turning the sentence over before she finally let herself set the self-blame down. There came an evening, nearly a year after that quiet realization in the driveway, when Claire came home to an empty house and found her sister's earring on the floor beside her own bed, a small silver hoop Claire recognized immediately, one Danielle had worn to dinner 2 weeks earlier. She sat down on the edge of the mattress and held it in her palm for a long time, feeling something inside her go very still, less like anger and more like the particular quiet that comes right before you finally allow yourself to cry. She didn't confront either of them that night. She wasn't ready yet, not because she needed more proof, but because some part of her understood that once she said the words out loud, there would be no version of her marriage or her relationship with her sister that survived intact, and she needed a little more time to grieve both of those things privately before she had to grieve them in front of everyone else too. Over the following months, Claire moved through her own life, like someone learning to walk again after an injury, carefully, quietly, one day at a time. She kept working her hospital shifts. She kept cooking dinner most nights. She kept smiling at family gatherings, even the ones Danielle attended, because she wasn't yet ready for anyone else to see the grief she was still carrying alone. She spoke to a lawyer only once during this period, briefly and without much detail, mostly because a friend gently suggested she at least understand her options before she had to make any decisions, and Claire, always practical, even in heartbreak, thought that was probably wise advice to follow. The only person Claire let herself lean on during those months was her closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Renata, who'd known her since they were both 22 and terrified of their first clinical rotation together. Renata was the one who noticed, before Claire ever said a word, that something had gone quiet behind her friend's eyes, and who simply sat with her one evening after a shift, not asking questions, until Claire finally told her everything in a single unbroken breath. The driveway, the earring, the year of small details she'd talked herself out of noticing. Renata didn't tell her what to do. She just held her hand across the break room table and said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight. You just have to keep breathing until tomorrow." Claire held on to that sentence for months afterward. On the nights breathing felt like the only manageable task in front of her. What she remembers most from those quiet months isn't any single piece of evidence she gathered, but the slow, painful process of grieving a marriage while still living inside it, setting the table for two, folding Ryan's laundry, listening to him talk about his day, all while carrying a private ache that had nowhere yet to go. She grieved her sister too, in a different way, mourning the version of Danielle she'd spent her whole life believing in, the little sister she'd once walked to school, the maid of honor who'd cried real tears at her wedding. Claire found that the hardest part wasn't imagining a future without Ryan. It was accepting that the past with Danielle might not have been as real as she'd always believed it was. The moment everything finally came into the open arrived on the night of Claire and Ryan's 9th wedding anniversary at a small family dinner her mother had organized to celebrate, unknowingly inviting Danielle along as well, the way she always did. The evening began ordinarily enough, 4 courses at a quiet Italian restaurant. Ryan raised a toast to 9 years of marriage, and Claire watched him do it with an expression that felt, even to her, strangely far away, as though she were watching the whole scene happen to someone else. It was Claire who finally said it, partway through the main course, setting down her fork with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady. "I know about the two of you," she said, quietly enough that only their small table could hear, but clearly enough that no one at it could pretend they'd misheard. "I've known for a while now, actually. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet." The silence that followed felt, to Claire, like it lasted an entire lifetime, though it likely only lasted a few seconds. Ryan's face went pale. Danielle, to her credit, or perhaps simply out of exhaustion at carrying the secret any longer, was the one who finally spoke. "Claire, she started, then stopped, seeming to understand there was no version of the next sentence that wouldn't make things worse. "I've been seeing your sister for over a year," Ryan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying it quietly might somehow soften it. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you like this." Claire looked between them both for a long moment, feeling, strangely, less devastation in that instant than she'd expected, most of it having already moved through her slowly, privately, over the past year. "I know," she said simply. "I've known for a while. I just needed time to grieve it before I had to say it out loud in front of everyone." Danielle pale now, reached toward her sister's hand across the table. "Claire, please, can we talk about this somewhere private?" Claire gently pulled her hand back, not unkindly, but with a finality that surprised even her. "I don't think there's anything left to say privately," she said. "You had a year of private conversations with my husband. I think this one deserves to happen out loud." Their mother, frozen at the head of the table through the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice thin with shock. "I had no idea," she said, looking between her two daughters. "Danielle, please tell me this isn't true." Danielle said nothing, which was, in its own way, all the answer anyone at the table needed. The months that followed were slow and painful. In the ordinary way, heartbreak is slow and painful. Nothing dramatic, mostly just the quiet, exhausting work of untangling a life built around another person. Claire moved out of the bedroom she'd shared with Ryan and into her mother's spare room for a few weeks while she found her footing, then into a small apartment of her own closer to the hospital. Ryan, for his part, seemed to shrink in the months following the anniversary dinner. The easy confidence Claire had once found, so comforting, curdling, under the weight of what he'd done, into something more restless and uncertain. Renata helped her move into the new apartment on a gray Saturday in October, the two of them carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs in near silence, until they finally sat down on the bare living room floor, too tired to unpack another thing, surrounded by half-taped boxes and the particular emptiness of a space that didn't feel like home yet. "It's going to feel strange for a while," Renata said, handing her a lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. "And then one day it won't. And you probably won't even notice the exact moment it happened." Claire remembers looking around at the bare walls that evening and thinking, for the first time since the anniversary dinner, that she could actually picture herself living there, not just surviving there, and that the difference between those two things mattered more than she'd expected it to. There were harder nights too, nights when Claire found herself reaching for her phone out of habit to tell Ryan something small and funny that had happened at work, before remembering all over again that she no longer had anyone to tell it to. She grieved those small habits almost as much as she grieved the marriage itself, the years of shared language and inside jokes that had nowhere left to land. Renata took her calls at odd hours during those months without complaint, and Claire's mother, once she'd fully absorbed what had happened, began showing up at Claire's apartment on Sunday afternoons, with groceries neither of them mentioned out loud, the quiet kind of care that didn't need announcing to matter. What neither Ryan nor Danielle expected, once the secrecy that had defined their entire relationship disappeared, was how little seemed to remain underneath it. Whatever had drawn them together, whatever urgency had made a year of hidden dinners and stolen afternoons feel so vital, seemed to evaporate almost immediately once there was nothing left to hide. Without the tension of secrecy holding them together, Ryan and Danielle discovered, within a matter of months, how little they actually had in common once the excitement of doing something forbidden was gone. Danielle's world, once so full of easy warmth and effortless welcome everywhere she went, grew quieter in ways she hadn't anticipated. Family gatherings she'd once been the center of no longer included her. Friends who'd once adored her drifted away, uncomfortable, in the way people often are, standing too close to a story like this one. Their mother, who had spent a lifetime finding gentle explanations for Danielle's mistakes, found herself, for the first time, without one, and the distance that grew between them lasted far longer than anyone in the family expected. Ryan and Danielle's relationship didn't survive much past its second year. Both of them left, in the end, with considerably less than either had imagined they were reaching for. Their Aunt Carol, who had hosted the extended family's 4th of July gathering every year for as long as anyone could remember, quietly stopped including Danielle on the invitation list the following summer. A decision she never explained directly, but which everyone in the family understood without needing it spelled out. Cousins who'd once tagged Danielle in every family photo online stopped mentioning her at all. It wasn't an organized punishment. Nobody sat down and decided to freeze her out. It was simply the slow, natural erosion of goodwill that happens when someone spends the warmth other people extended to them on something that hurt the person who loved them most. Claire heard, secondhand, and much later, that Ryan had reached out once, almost a year after the divorce was finalized, through a mutual friend, asking whether Claire might be open to talking things through someday. Claire never responded. It wasn't spite, she said later, so much as a recognition that whatever explanation he might offer wouldn't actually change anything about the year she'd spent quietly grieving a marriage that had already ended long before either of them said so out loud. Some conversations, she'd come to believe, mattered more in the moment they were needed than in whatever came afterward. And the moment for that one had passed the night at the restaurant, when neither of them had chosen honesty until she forced it into the open herself. Claire heard, secondhand and much later, that Danielle had gone through a difficult stretch during that time. One Christmas spent entirely alone in her apartment. Unable to bring herself to attend the family gathering she knew she was no longer welcome at, and unwilling, out of pride or shame or some tangle of both, to reach out to Claire directly to ask for anything resembling forgiveness. Claire felt something complicated when she heard that story. Not satisfaction exactly, but not quite sympathy either. More a quiet acknowledgement that some choices simply carry their own weather with them, long after the moment of choosing has passed. Claire, for her part, rebuilt something quieter and steadier. She leaned back into her nursing career, found comfort in the same methodical routines that had always steadied her, and slowly led a small circle of old friends back into her life, the ones who'd stood beside her without needing convincing once the truth came out. She and her mother eventually found their way back to each other too, though it took nearly 2 years and several honest, difficult conversations before her mother could admit how much she'd once softened Danielle's choices out of old habit rather than genuine doubt. "I think I spent so many years excusing her for small things," her mother admitted to Claire one evening, "that by the time it mattered, I didn't know how to stop." Claire didn't have a tidy response for that, only the quiet relief of finally hearing her mother name the pattern out loud, after a lifetime of both of them simply living inside it. Claire and Danielle have not spoken since that anniversary dinner. Claire says on the rare occasions the subject comes up that she doesn't carry sharp anger toward her sister anymore, not because she's forgotten what happened, but because she eventually realized she didn't need Danielle's remorse in order to feel whole again. "I used to think the hardest part was losing my marriage," Claire said once quietly to Renata, who'd stayed by her side through all of it. "But looking back, I don't think that was really the biggest loss. It was losing the version of my sister I'd spent my whole life believing in. I'm still not sure that version of her was ever fully real." 3 years after the anniversary dinner, Claire began seeing someone new, a physical therapist named David, who worked a few floors down from her at the same hospital, patient and unhurried in a way that reminded her, at first uncomfortably, of Ryan, before she came to understand that the resemblance was only surface deep. What mattered more, she found, was how differently she carried herself in this new relationship, slower to hand over her whole trust, quicker to notice small inconsistencies, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a hard-won respect for her own instincts, the ones she'd once talked herself out of trusting for nearly 2 years. What stays with Claire most isn't the anniversary dinner itself, or even the quiet, sad shape of what eventually became of Ryan and Danielle's relationship. It's the year she spent grieving something privately before the rest of the world ever knew there was anything to grieve, learning, slowly, and without anyone's help, how to carry a broken heart with dignity until she was finally truly ready to set it down.